In a shocking incident, a motel owner blatantly refused to provide accommodation to a foreign visitor. Instead of engaging in an argument, the visitor resorted to an even more appalling response, escalating the situation beyond a mere argument. That choice led to circumstances where both their lives were put in grave danger. Motel owner refuses to give foreigner a room. Instead of arguing, he does something worse. Edgar was utterly tired after spending an entire day in his car. He was traveling toward a business conference, but with night falling, a place to stay was his first priority. That's why he was happy to see the motel sign popping up in the distance, but that happiness would be short-lived. He entered the motel with a comfortable bed in mind. The thought of a good night's sleep was something he longed for deeply. But once Edgar stepped foot in the motel and asked for a room, the woman behind the reception blatantly refused him. She stood up, looked angry, and pointed towards the exit. Edgar was in shock by her reaction. How could she treat someone like that? But when he tried to speak, the woman said sneeringly, "We're full. Get out." It was obvious to Edgar that this was just some lame excuse, as he could see room keys hanging on the board behind her. He felt like he knew exactly what this was about. It wasn't Edgar's first rodeo, and he was accustomed to this kind of treatment. But yet it still disgusted him every time. Edgar looked into the woman's eyes and realized that arguing was futile. He had to find another way. Edgar frustratingly dropped himself into the car seat. "Let's get out of here," he mumbled as he opened the navigation to search for another motel, but unfortunately, none were nearby. Edgar was starting to realize that his vehicle would be his bed for the night. But not long after closing his eyes, that all changed. The car was a little small, which made finding a sleeping position challenging for Edgar. So he spent most of his time staring out the car window. And because of that, he saw something he clearly wasn't supposed to. Edgar saw the motel owner sneak out of a room while looking around suspiciously. Maybe it was because of the tiring night and his desire for a good night of sleep, but Edgar could swear the woman had just left an empty room. Something inside of him ignited as he realized he was right to think she lied about being fully booked. This was his chance to confront her. Edgar saw that the owner was almost at the reception again. So, he quickened his steps to avoid getting faced with a locked door. But Edgar was stopped in his tracks when he passed the room she had just exited. A weird sound came from inside. Maybe this room wasn't as empty as he had thought. A frown appeared on Edgar's face as it went silent for a moment before the sound would re-emerge again. It sounded so familiar. He felt like he knew it, but from where? Edgar was about to put his ear on the door when he noticed a small gap in the blinds. He felt a surge of adrenaline going through his body and looked through the gap without hesitation, but his heart skipped a beat when he saw the scene unfold before him. Edgar immediately recognized that the sound originated from a cash counting machine since he worked for an international bank. But there was something else. 3 shady-looking individuals were counting enormous amounts of bills inside. One of them looked in his direction, so Edgar quickly moved away from the window. These guys were obviously involved in something illegal. Edgar felt his heart throb in his chest. What kind of criminal activities did he end up in? Edgar stood next to the window with his back against the wall. First, the situation with the owner, and now this? He tried to regain himself by breathing deeply and then remembered something. The owner had walked out of this very room. Did she know what these people were up to? It wouldn't surprise him. Edgar contemplated what to do. He started out wanting a night's sleep, but that part was long gone. A normal person would cut their losses and escape this situation because it seemed dangerous. But Edgar chose the opposite. He couldn't confront the 3 individuals in the room by himself. But the motel owner sat alone at the reception. So, hesitantly, he pushed himself away from the suspicious room and went to the woman's office. He saw a light burning inside and watched the motel owner pacing around nervously. She was involved, she had to be. So when Edgar noticed that her office wasn't locked, he swung open the door. Edgar confronted the woman, but when he opened his mouth, the woman interrupted him with loud screams. "Get out of this place now." She even used a baseball bat to scare him off. Her aggressive approach worked because before Edgar knew it, he stood beside his car again. But Edgar wasn't ready to give up. Confronted with the dilemma, Edgar's thoughts lingered on the men counting money and the motel owner's strange behavior. Why did she really turn him away? Was she just rude, or was there something more sinister going on? He needed answers, and calling the police seemed not just a lesson for her, but a step towards uncovering a deeper truth. Edgar called the police and started to tell them everything. He talked about the motel owner not letting him stay and then about seeing the men in the room. But just as he was going to say more about the money, the police officer on the phone cut him off. Edgar could hear the officer's tone change instantly. As Edgar detailed his portrayal of the men, the policeman's tone shifted to a grave seriousness. In the background, Edgar heard increasing commotion at the police station, phones ringing, urgent voices, and hurried footsteps. It was as if his description set off a flurry of activity. But he still had no idea why. After Edgar's explanation, the policeman informed him that an entire quadrant of police cars was already on their way. Edgar could hear the sirens through the phone as they left the station. The commotion left Edgar confused. What's happening? He wondered out loud. It seemed the police were oddly familiar with the situation at the motel. The fleet of cars arrived in just a few minutes, and at least 20 officers surrounded the motel. There were no sirens or flashing lights, so not to speak the men inside. A door was kicked in, and with skill and precision, the mysterious men were apprehended. But why? What did they do? Edgar watched in confusion as the police focused solely on the men, leaving the motel owner untouched. That can't be right, he muttered, as he kept staring at her office. Seeking clarity, he approached a nearby officer, eager to understand why the owner, who clearly had something to do with all of this, was left out of the picture. Edgar quickly found the head officer and started flooding him with questions. The most important one was why they left the motel owner out of the investigation. She was the one acting strangely, after all. But when the officer wanted to answer, they were interrupted by a door slamming shut behind them. It was the motel owner who had slammed her office door shut. She approached Edgar and the officer. And as she neared, Edgar braced for a confrontation. However, to his surprise, instead of hostility, she suddenly embraced him. The unexpected gesture stunned Edgar. His mind raced to understand what was happening. Edgar, overwhelmed by anger and confusion, forcefully broke free from the motel owner's tight hug. "What are you doing?" he said, demanding. Her sudden behavior change was messing with his brain. It was in such sharp contrast with her earlier actions that it left him dazed momentarily. "Someone help me out here," he shouted. Relieved and grateful, the motel owner thanked Edgar for calling the police. She explained that the criminals had been holding her hostage in her own motel for a while now. She was forced to harbor them and do their bidding under threat of intimidation. But now she was finally free again. All thanks to Edgar's quick thinking. While the motel owner continued her explanation, grateful for Edgar's intervention, the lead police officer was discreetly pulled aside by a colleague. They stood about 10 feet away and spoke in hushed tones, adding a bit of mystery to the scene. Edgar got an eerie feeling from it. "This isn't over yet," he mumbled softly. Edgar stood there, still trying to make sense of the whirlwind events of this night, when the officer approached them again with a grave look. "I'm sorry, but we've got bad news," the officer began, his tone somber. Edgar braced himself, realizing that this complex night was far from over. The officer mostly apologized to the motel owner because what they found out affected her personally. "We haven't apprehended all the criminals involved. There is still one at large, which means you might still be in danger," he explained. The motel owner's face turned pale, reflecting her renewed fear of the situation. "Who's missing?" she asked. The officer looked puzzled. He shared that their intel indicated a group of 4 criminals was supposed to be at work here, but they had only caught 3. Could they have been tipped off? Or is there a mole among us? He wondered aloud. If that was the case, they had to be careful who they talked to. As the police car headed to the station, Edgar and the motel owner sat in the back seats with worried looks on their faces. The officer driving shared his suspicion of a mole within the force itself. He had a hunch for a while now, but the missing criminal added weight to his suspicion. Once they arrived at the station, the officer proposed witness protection for their safety. But Edgar turned down the offer instantly, explaining he couldn't leave his business behind. Instead, he himself offered to help the police. He wanted to aid in the investigation, making sure that justice prevailed. "What can I do?" The officers initially resisted Edgar's offer to help, but his firm resolve swayed them. They agreed to collaborate, prioritizing the urgent task of unmasking the mole and the police force first. And Edgar's sharp analytical skills from his banking career proved valuable. They systematically narrowed down suspects at a rapid pace. The discovery of the mole within the police department began with Edgar's methodical approach, his banking background enabling him to analyze patterns and inconsistencies in police reports and communications. He spent hours with a small team of trusted officers, sifting through reams of documents and call logs. And then there was a breakthrough. The breakthrough came when Edgar noticed an irregular pattern of communications from one officer who seemed to be in touch with unknown numbers at critical times. The suspect was Officer Danvers, a seemingly unremarkable but well-respected force member. They pulled him in for interrogation. And to their surprise, he snapped pretty quickly. Danvers followed their progress tightly and felt their research closing in on him. And as a member of the police force, he knew that there was no point in running. So, instead, he caved quickly and offered help with capturing the fourth criminal. He also had some extra news to sweeten the pot. Apparently, this fourth member was the brains behind the whole operation. He used Danvers police to stay one step ahead of the police the entire time. And it worked up until this point. His criminal colleagues took the fall, and he got away with most of the money. At least, that was what he thought. As the investigation delved deeper, Edgar and the police team relied on the reluctant but cooperative Danvers. With his knowledge, they planned to trap the elusive fourth criminal. Danvers revealed that the criminal, known as Marco, was extremely cautious and operated with intricate plans. However, Danvers also knew Marco's Achilles heel. It was Marco's paranoia that held him back. They decided to exploit this by feeding him false information through Danvers, making him believe that his location was compromised and his associates were turning against him. With his analytical mind, Edgar helped orchestrate a convincing narrative, making him vital in hunting the infamous Marco. They informed Marco through Danvers that the police had intercepted a large sum of money meant for him and were closing in on his hideout. Panicked, Marco contacted Danvers, seeking a safe haven. Danvers, acting on the police's plan, directed him to an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts, assuring him it was secure. Unbeknownst to Marco, this was precisely what the police wanted. As he made his way to the warehouse, an extensive police force, including Edgar and the motel owner, watched from a safe distance, concealed and ready to strike. Edgar couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline. He was an ordinary man caught up in an extraordinary situation. Marco arrived at the warehouse, his demeanor cautious yet confident. He quickly entered, unaware of the eyes tracking his every move. Once inside, he checked his surroundings, but the dimly lit, empty warehouse offered no hint of the trap laid out for him. As Marco settled in, confident of his safety, the police made their move. They silently surrounded the building coordinated, cutting off any escape routes for the trapped criminal. Edgar watched, holding his breath, as the police prepared to breach the warehouse. The operation was swift and precise. And within minutes, the police had stormed the building, apprehending Marco before he could even react. The realization of his capture dawned on him as he was handcuffed and led out of the warehouse. His reign of criminal activities had come to an abrupt end. In the following weeks, the legal proceedings took place. The four criminals, along with Danvers, faced multiple charges, including extortion, money laundering, and corruption. Their trials were brief but intense, with Edgar and the motel owner testifying about their experiences. The jury found them all guilty, and they were sentenced to long prison terms. For Edgar and the motel owner, life slowly returned to normal. Edgar, hailed as a hero, returned to his banking job, but the experience had changed him. He felt a deeper sense of justice and understood the thin line between right and wrong. The motel owner, now free from the criminal's grip, was able to run her business without fear. She often thanked Edgar for his bravery, acknowledging that his actions had not only saved her but also brought a criminal ring to justice. Months later, Edgar visited the motel again, this time welcomed warmly by the owner. They shared a cup of coffee, reflecting on the bizarre series of events that had brought them together. Edgar looked around the now peaceful motel, a stark contrast to the chaotic night that had started it all. As he drove away from the motel, Edgar couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had played a crucial role in dismantling a dangerous criminal operation and restoring peace to a small part of the world. The experience had taught him that sometimes, being in the wrong place at the right time could make all the difference. And with that, Edgar continued his journey, a little wiser. He would remain in close contact with the hotel owner, who he even called a friend after a while. "Funny how life turns out sometimes," Edgar said, smiling as he drove homeward, where a bed and a good night's sleep awaited him. Everything worked out in the end. But that doesn't mean Edgar did not make some wrong snap judgments. He assumed that the motel owner sent him away for the wrong reasons, convicting her without proof or motive. A lesson learned by him, but also a lesson to everyone, to not judge a book by its cover.